I remember the storm coming out of nowhere, a sudden wall of wind and wet that pushed us off the trail before we even realized how fast the weather had changed. It was March 2017, deep in the Colorado Rockies, and the mountains were still holding on to winter. Snow lay thick along the higher ridges, and patches of ice hid beneath layers of melting powder along the switchbacks. I'd been hiking with a friend, someone I trusted completely, and we had planned what we thought was a simple loop. By late afternoon, we were moving slower than expected, the clouds above darkening and stretching across the peaks like a low-hanging ceiling. We underestimated the storm. We lost the trail by dusk. The first time I noticed it, the wind was carrying something more than snow. Movement. Tall shapes standing between the trees, always just out of reach of the headlamp's beam. I slowed down, squinting, thinking it was the way the trees bent in the wind, the light reflecting oddly off the snow and ice. My friend didn't say anything, but I could feel him tense beside me. We both knew it wasn't the wind. Our footsteps were loud against the soft snow, a clear rhythm we could follow, but at some point, we noticed prints ahead of us, crossing the trail from left to right. They were ours, but they shouldn't have been. We hadn't gone that way yet. I stopped and crouched, tracing a gloved finger along the edge of one of the prints. The snow was compacted, fresh, and the depth matched our weight. I could see the ridge where the heel pressed down, the toes splayed slightly. I stood back up and looked around. There was nothing moving that we could see, but the sound of breathing, steady, low, and close, made the hair on my neck rise. It wasn't mine, it wasn't my friend's. I turned slowly, scanning the dark shapes between the trunks. The light from my headlamp barely reached a few feet into the forest, and beyond that, everything was shadow. We tried to follow the trail where it seemed most obvious, but every few minutes we would step into a depression, a rut in the snow, or a mound of broken branches and realize we'd gone in a circle. The forest had swallowed the trail. It wasn't just that it was dark. There were landmarks, fallen trees, rocks, and ridges, all of which we thought we could use to navigate, but none of them matched up with what we remembered. Every direction looked the same. The shapes kept moving, always just at the edge of the beam, shifting slightly, adjusting as if tracking us. The wind carried them in a whispering way, brushing against the needles of the pines. I kept telling myself it was just a trick of the light. Snow clinging to branches, maybe the tall pines casting shadows that my tired eyes couldn't resolve. The breathing stayed with us. Sometimes it slowed when we paused, and then it would quicken when we moved. It didn't sound human, not in pitch, not in rhythm, but it was deliberate, measured. It matched our pace exactly. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was always slightly behind us, or beside us, sometimes ahead, but never caught in the light long enough to see. My friend kept glancing around, but we were both too tense to speak. We just walked, trying to keep our pace steady, trying not to panic. As night fell fully, the temperature dropped sharply. My hands went numb through the gloves, and every breath felt heavy, fogging in front of my face. Snow fell in sheets, heavy and wet, sticking to my hair, my jacket, my backpack. The forest became a maze of white and black, snow-laden branches bending into the trail, forcing us to duck and push through. We found a small clearing, maybe 20 feet across, where we stopped to get our bearings. I could see our own footprints leading into the clearing, and I froze. More prints crossed them, running perpendicular again. Whoever, or whatever, had made them had moved around us while we were still moving. They didn't connect to any visible path. We stayed in the clearing for what felt like hours, shivering and exhausted. I remember watching the shapes in the trees, trying to discern anything recognizable. They were too tall, too straight, too smooth. The wind shifted, and one of them seemed to step into the beam for a moment, and I could make out a shape like a human figure, but elongated, unnatural in proportion, limbs long and thin. Then it was gone, just a shadow again. My heart was pounding, my mouth dry. We didn't say anything. We couldn't. I kept looking for the trail, following the snow where it seemed most compacted, hoping for any sign of the markers we'd passed earlier. Then I realized something else. The snow had started to crunch differently beneath our feet. There was a deeper, heavier step somewhere just behind us, keeping pace. I stopped abruptly. The sound stopped. I looked back. Nothing. I moved again. It moved again. It was testing us, following us, staying just far enough to avoid the light. We finally decided to push downhill, hoping the slope would lead us back to the road or a visible landmark. The snow was treacherous, melting on top of ice, and our legs burned with each careful step. Every now and then, I would catch glimpses of movement, blurred and slow. I tried not to think about it too much, tried to convince myself that someone else was lost in the storm too, another hiker or maybe a hunter. But the prints, the timing, the way the movement matched ours, it didn't make sense. By some small miracle, we reached the base of the ridge and spotted a logging road, partially buried in snow. Relief washed over me. We moved onto it cautiously, scanning the tree line for any signs, and the breathing stopped. The shapes stopped. It was as if they had vanished entirely, like they never existed. We followed the road for an hour, slipping and tripping over ice, but finally reached a small ranger station. Warmth, light, and radios filled the space, and we collapsed on the floor, shivering and silent. The rangers looked at us with concern, asking questions, but I didn't even try to explain. Nothing we could say would make sense. Later, when we walked the area in daylight, there were no tracks. The trail was intact, the footprints we'd seen gone. The terrain was uneven, but nothing that could account for the strange, elongated shapes we had glimpsed or the prints crossing ours while we walked. The only explanation that made sense was that we had been followed by something human-sized, walking upright, moving with awareness of us. But no one in the area reported any other hikers lost, and the rangers confirmed that. It took me weeks to stop replaying that night in my head, trying to rationalize what had happened. Even now, when I hike alone in the Rockies, I notice shadows in the trees, the sound of my own breathing exaggerated by the wind. I never saw the figure clearly, never heard anything besides the measured, deliberate breathing. Whatever it was real, human or not, and it had been tracking us, intelligent enough to stay just out of reach. I call it cryptid adjacent in my own mind because it wasn't a monster. It wasn't supernatural. It was something alive, something aware, something patient and silent. And that's what made it terrifying. Not the storm, not the cold, not the snow. The knowledge that we weren't alone, that something had walked with us for hours, matching our pace, observing us, always out of the light. The storm broke the next morning. Sun hit the snow, and the tracks we had followed were visible in a perfect line down the ridge. I traced them as far as I could. Then I noticed another set of prints, merging with ours at points and diverging at others, just as I remembered. They weren't ours, they never were. Whoever it had been, had moved around us, keeping pace, always patient, always silent. I never found out who, or what it was. I can only guess it was another person, maybe lost like us, but every rational explanation falls short when I remember how precise it had been, how carefully it had followed without ever stepping into the light for long enough to see. That night, in the Colorado Rockies, I learned that even when you survive, knowing you were hunted in the simplest, most patient way can leave a mark that doesn't fade. I've hiked since then. I avoid that trail. I avoid that ridge. And I still remember the breathing that wasn't mine or my friends, keeping perfect time with ours. I don't know if I'll ever see it again, but I know it's there, somewhere in those trees, waiting, moving silently, just out of reach. And I know it's real. The wind came first. Not the kind that rattles the windows or bends the trees, but a weightless, biting presence that seemed to crawl under every layer of clothing. I had been out on the ridge for hours already, the gray sky lowering around me as if the mountain itself was closing in. Snow had begun falling in the mid-afternoon, fine at first, almost gentle, but by the time we were halfway through the search, it had thickened to a relentless white curtain that erased depth and distance. My partner and I were moving in pairs, tethered by a rope, a standard procedure for low-visibility conditions. It should have been straightforward, but that kind of clarity doesn't exist in a blizzard. I could barely see my own boots as I stepped, every movement muffled by the heavy snow. My breaths came in ragged puffs, fogging immediately, and every exhale felt like it was being stolen back by the cold. The rope between me and my partner was taut most of the time, a comforting line of connection in the disorienting white. Occasionally, I could hear the scrape of her boots against the rocks, the rhythm of someone moving at the same pace, alive and present. Then, without warning, it slackened. I jerked around, expecting to see her catch on something or stumble, but there was nothing. The rope lay across the snow like a discarded line, vanishing into the white. I bent to grab it, but there was no pull, no weight. The snow around it was untouched, pristine, except for the shallow impressions my own boots had left. No footprints led away from it. Nothing. I froze. The blizzard hadn't changed. The wind was still biting, still sharp, but there was an eerie quiet in the way the rope sat there. It made no sense. I pulled my radio from my pack, fingers stiff and clumsy. The static was loud in my ears at first, but then a voice came through, clipped and direct, insisting that my partner had never been assigned to me. I checked the list, my own handwriting from earlier in the day, and every name was accounted for, none hers. I tried to argue, to explain, but the voice didn't pause, didn't acknowledge confusion. The line went dead. The rope, the footprints, the feeling of someone right there. It made me question what I had been feeling all along. Had I imagined the steps, the presence? That was impossible. I had felt it. I had relied on it. I started moving again, the rope coiled in one hand, trudging through snow that had risen to my knees. Each step required effort, every muscle working to lift and pull myself forward. Visibility was nearly zero, the snow forming drifts that changed shape with each gust. My gloves were soaked, my fingers stiff, but I kept moving. I had to. The hiker we were looking for could be anywhere, lost, vulnerable. The thought propelled me forward, despite the gnawing doubt lodged in my chest. Hours passed. I marked my path carefully, digging sticks into the snow to leave a trail. The cold pressed against me in layers, down my neck, through my boots, and at some point, I realized the storm was not only external, it had invaded my mind. I kept turning, half expecting to see someone just behind me, the rope dragging or a boot catching in the drift. But there was nothing. Only the wind, the snow, and the unbroken whiteness. Each time I checked my compass, I felt a hollow shift in my stomach. I had been trained for disorientation, for conditions like this, but this felt different. The emptiness of the storm, the sudden disappearance of a tether I had counted on. It was a breach in the expected, and it gnawed at me. I descended a slope where the snow had piled into an unnatural curve, making the world appear as though it was molding itself around me. I caught the faint outline of a tree, marked with a ribbon from an earlier pass, and my pulse slowed. The familiar gave me something to hold on to. I pressed on, leaning heavily on my poles, the sound of the wind in my ears a constant roar. The line of the rope in my hand had become almost ceremonial, a link to something that had vanished. I followed the pre-marked trail down toward the valley, noting landmarks I had memorized in daylight, rock formations, a lone boulder, the bend in the creek now frozen beneath a layer of snow. By evening, exhaustion had sunk deep into my bones. My breath came in short, shallow bursts, and I was acutely aware of the cold biting through every seam of my clothing. I came upon the edge of a small clearing, where the trees opened to a drop-off leading to the ranger station. I stopped to catch my breath, the wind ripping across the open space. I looked down and saw the faint glow of lights. Relief and fear collided. Relief because I was nearing safety, fear because the blizzard had shifted again, and the path was not as I remembered. The line of snow I had cut with my boots was being swallowed, leaving me unsure of my own steps. The station came into view fully, and I moved toward it slowly, counting each step. My fingers and toes were numb, my cheeks burning with frostbite waiting to happen. Inside, the warmth hit me like a wave. Other volunteers were gathered around tables, their faces pale, eyes wide. They were talking quietly, examining maps and checking radios. I removed my jacket, letting it drop to the floor, still gripping the rope. Someone noticed the line in my hand and frowned, asking what it was for. I explained, voice hoarse. They shook their heads, confused. The list was pulled out again. No one by that name had been on the mountain, no one assigned to me. I spent the rest of the evening replaying everything. The rope, the footsteps, the feeling of someone there, the storm. I realized it had been a stranger, someone who had followed the standard search patterns, someone whose presence I had interpreted as my partner because of the disorientation and stress. In the whiteout, the human mind tries to fill gaps. It tries to make sense of patterns, to anchor itself. I had anchored myself to someone who wasn't there, and the rope, the slack, the cut, the untraceable footprints, had been the accidental proof of that illusion. Someone else had been moving through the storm, using the same routes, the same logic, perhaps even the same rope. Or perhaps it had been left by a previous team, covered over by snow and ice, and I had stumbled into it at the precise moment of disorientation to convince myself it was real. I left the station that night after reporting my own route and findings, the storm still raging outside, but lighter than it had been. Driving home, I kept glancing at the empty road through falling snow, thinking of the thin line between presence and absence, reality and imagination. and how easily one could be convinced of the wrong thing when the world around you is reduced to white and wind. The rope had been a tether to certainty, and when it disappeared, so did my sense of it. Nothing supernatural, no monsters, no ghosts. Just the mountain, the blizzard, and the human mind pushed to the edge, desperate for connection. And that was terrifying enough. The next day, search logs confirmed no missing hikers beyond the one we had been assigned. The rope was found folded neatly behind the ridge where I had picked it up, untouched, its other end cut cleanly, likely from an earlier training exercise. The thought of someone else having been in the same exact place, at the same exact time, vanished under that explanation. It was mechanical, procedural, human error meeting natural chaos. The weight of it stayed with me, the image of the slack line in the snow, the absence where someone should have been, and the realization that the mind can convince itself of presence where there is none. I never doubted the mountain again, or the blizzard. Only myself. By the time spring arrived, I had returned to the same trails, same ridges, same search patterns. I moved deliberately, doubly aware of the disorienting effect of snow, the fragility of perception. The memory of that day remained, a marker of both fear and clarity. The rope, the missing partner, the storm that erased certainty. I knew then that sometimes the most terrifying things are not the unexplained, but the entirely explainable, when the human mind meets the raw unpredictability of the world, and the world doesn't care. I was alone in northern Alberta in December 2018, working pipeline inspection. The route had me far from any town, on a stretch of open field that felt endless even under the weak winter sun. By evening, the forecasted storm had rolled in faster than expected. The wind picked up so quickly it rattled the prefab shack I was assigned to, a small metal-sided structure meant only for temporary shelter. I had spent the day moving between inspection points, and by the time I reached the shack, the first flurries were already thickening into snow that reduced visibility to nothing. I had a little food, water, and the generator that was supposed to run through the night. I set the generator outside, tethered to the shack with the cord running through the small hatch by the door, and checked the radio. The device crackled, but I couldn't make a solid connection. Static hissed and jumped at me like it was alive. I tried several frequencies, tapping buttons, turning the knobs slowly. Nothing. My stomach sank a little. Alone in the storm, the radio would have been my lifeline. I made a small fire in the portable heater, though it barely pushed back the cold that crept through the metal walls. The wind outside was constant, carrying the sound of snow scraping across the field, distant branches snapping under the weight of ice. I stayed near the heater, boots off, knees drawn up, trying to preserve warmth while scanning the frost-coated window. The glass was partially opaque, frozen in thick layers of ice crystals that caught the faint light from the generator and the white sky beyond. Around 2 a.m, the generator sputtered and died. The silence that followed was immediate. I froze, realizing I could hear nothing but the storm itself and the wind thrumming against the shack. I checked the cords and switches. Everything seemed fine, but the generator refused to turn over. I crouched low and pressed my ear to the shack's thin wall, half expecting a gust to tear it away, half expecting to hear something else. When I finally pulled myself to the window, I saw the first sign that made my stomach tighten. Boot prints in the snow circled the shack. They were faint, half filled in already by fresh snow, but they didn't lead to or from the road. They started in the middle of the field, in the open, and looped all the way around to end near the door. I crouched closer, tracing them with my eyes. Each print was large, deliberate, almost measured. Whoever had made them had walked slowly, methodically, right there in the middle of nowhere. I backed away from the window and tried to rationalize. Hunters, someone checking equipment, maybe a worker from the pipeline team who had lost his way. But nothing fit. No one should have been out here. The storm had come down fast. Tracks elsewhere in the field were covered by snow. Even the road leading to the shack was empty and untouched since I arrived. The prints started in the open field and ended here. No approach, no exit. That meant whoever made them had been standing, walking, circling, and disappeared without a trace. I tried to ignore it and focused on fixing the generator. Outside, the wind hit in waves, bending the small metal shack like it might collapse. I dressed in every layer I had, trudged outside, and knelt by the machine. The cords were frozen stiff, the pull cord almost impossible to move. I yanked, breathed on the mechanism, tried over and over. Finally, it coughed and died again. That's when I noticed the prints in the snow leading away from the generator. They were different from the ones around the shack, smaller, narrower, as if someone had knelt there and then vanished. I got inside quickly, shivering, heart racing, but kept telling myself I was alone. The storm was thick enough that no one could have reached me unnoticed. I pulled the heater closer to the window, trying to see if the tracks were forming again. Outside, the field was a blank expanse, snow falling steadily, but I could swear I saw shapes moving. Just for a moment, quick shadows at the edge of visibility. Every time I blinked, they were gone. I tried sleeping in the chair, hugging a blanket, but I kept waking at every sound. My ears picked up every tap against the metal walls, every snap of frozen branches, and every hiss of snow piling against the shack. At some point, I convinced myself the prints must have been made by some local kid or a lost hiker earlier in the day. It was the only explanation that didn't make sense, yet my mind clung to it. By morning, the storm had slowed, and the light came weak and gray. I went outside carefully, boots crunching in the snow, and walked the perimeter of the shack. The prints were gone, completely covered by fresh snowfall, and there were no other disturbances in the field. I walked to the road, looking for signs of someone else, but there was nothing. I checked the radio again, still dead, and the generator, finally humming steadily this time. I kept scanning the field as I prepared to leave, trying to see anything I might have missed in the dark. Then I noticed something I hadn't before: depressions in the snow leading from the shack to the far end of the field. They were not footprints exactly, but shallow scuff marks, almost like something had been dragged. The marks started near where the generator had died, stretched in the same loop pattern the prints had formed, and ended abruptly in the middle of the field. I followed them a few steps, and then stopped. There was nothing beyond that point, just snow, sky, and wind. I took a deep breath and told myself it didn't matter. I had my equipment, my vehicle, and the road back to the main line was passable now. I packed quickly, double-checked everything, and drove off slowly, keeping my eyes on the field through the windshield. Every shadow looked like a figure, every mound of snow a person crouched. I didn't stop until I reached the next pipeline station several miles down the road, where lights were on and people were awake. I reported the generator issue, the storm's speed. No one asked about footprints or scuff marks. They didn't have to. I knew what I saw, and I also knew I would never forget the prints circling the shack, starting and ending in the middle of nowhere. Whoever had made them had no reason to be there, no tracks leading to or from, and no evidence of ever leaving. I checked maps later, aerial views, everything looked empty. No trails, no paths, nothing to indicate anyone had walked through that field. Years later, I still think about it whenever I drive through isolated areas, or when the wind howls across a flat field in the dead of winter. I never figured out what made those tracks. No one ever came forward, no lost hikers, no kids, no other crews. And I keep going back over the memory, trying to rationalize, but I never can. It's just the snow, the wind, and the footprints in the middle of nowhere, silent, measured, and impossible to explain. I understand what it was not. It was not supernatural. It was human, but it was someone or something that had the presence to appear, circle, and vanish in complete isolation. I left that field physically safe, but the certainty of being watched, of someone else's deliberate presence, stayed with me long after the storm cleared. It stayed with me whenever I travel alone. I can't forget the prints. I can't forget the calmness of the night, the generator gone silent, and the way the snow erased all evidence so quickly that when I looked outside at dawn, it seemed as if nothing had happened. And I know I'll never understand who it was or why they were there. The field, the shack, the storm, they are all just part of the memory now. But every detail is burned in my mind. Every step, every sound, every moment of that night was real, and every time I think about it, I feel the same chill I felt then, standing by the frost-covered window, staring at the field where footprints appeared from nowhere and circled back to nowhere. I remember the first day of the storm clearly. I had driven up the narrow, winding road to the fire lookout tower early in the morning. The sky a dull gray, and the wind already picking up. The tower itself was old, built decades ago, metal framing and a wooden cab at the top. It had been months since anyone had stayed there in winter, which was why I was alone. The job was simple: check the weather, report conditions, and keep an eye out for any signs of fire. I'd done it in summer, when the sun made everything look small and tame from that height, but winter was different. Winter made it impossible to tell where the world ended and the sky began. The mountains faded into one another in layers of gray and white. By the time I had climbed the stairs and reached the cab, the wind had turned sharp, slicing through the layers of my jacket. The cab swayed slightly as I moved around, testing the instruments, securing the radio, and stacking my supplies. I had brought enough food and water for a few days, just in case, but the real concern was heat. The old stove worked, but it was slow, and the tower itself offered no insulation. Every gust rattled the metal siding, and the whole structure creaked under its own weight. At first, I found the sounds almost comforting. The storm was outside, and I was inside, small but safe. I could see the snow whipping around the trees, the flakes turning the air into a white blur. I had the stove crackling, the radio checked in, and a thermos of coffee warming my hands. I felt steady, ready for the isolation. By nightfall, the wind had grown worse. It made the cab sway more violently, and the sound of snow hitting the metal walls was constant. I spent the first evening reading my log sheets and watching the trees bend under the gusts. The sky was an unbroken sheet of gray, no stars, no moon, nothing but motionless whiteness punctuated by the moving snow. It was silent in a way that felt alive, like the world had gone quiet and was waiting. My attention kept drifting to the trapdoor, the narrow hatch at the top of the stairs that led into the cab. It was locked from the inside, and I remembered locking it, even testing it twice. I didn't sleep well that first night. Every creak of the tower made me tense. Every wind gust that rattled the siding made me grip the railing. Sleep came in short bursts. When I finally drifted, it was with the constant awareness that if I fell, the fall would be fatal. The second day was worse. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. The snow piled against the tower's legs, and I couldn't see more than 20 feet beyond the platform. I double-checked my instruments constantly, noted every minor shift in wind speed and direction, even the subtlest changes in temperature. Time became meaningless. The radio crackled occasionally with other towers checking in, but the voices were distant and uneven, like they were speaking through a tunnel. Around late afternoon, I first heard it. At first, I wasn't sure. I thought it might be the storm itself, a larger gust striking the tower in a strange way. Then I heard a sound I couldn't explain, the slow, deliberate scrape of boots on the metal stairs outside. Not the kind of wind noise you ignore. Heavy steps, methodical. They climbed one by one, pause, scrape, pause, scrape. I froze. I radioed in, my voice betraying more nervousness than I intended. There was no response, just static that stretched and crackled. I tried again, slower, louder, still nothing. The steps continued, climbing just beneath the trapdoor. I pressed my back against the wall, listening. The storm's roar masked most of the noise, but the steps were precise, undeniable. Whoever it was, they had come prepared. They didn't rush. They didn't panic. They climbed steadily and stopped at the hatch, right below my feet. I realized then that the trapdoor wasn't the only thing keeping me safe. The storm was. Whoever, or whatever, was outside had no intention of forcing it open while I was inside. They waited. I couldn't see them, and they made no other sound beyond the steps on the metal. I watched the lock, the hatch, the small edges of the platform. I didn't move. The hours stretched. The wind raged, the snow piled higher, and the steps never moved. I ate nothing, drank little, my body stiff with cold and fear. I thought about climbing down, about trying to meet whoever was out there. I thought about what might happen if I did. Everything pointed toward staying put. The isolation I had expected to be dull now felt suffocating. Every creak of the tower made my heart jump. Eventually, the storm began to relent. It was slow, subtle. The wind softened, the snow fell in lighter sheets, and the metal siding rattled less. The steps were gone. Whoever had been there left without fanfare, leaving no trace except the depressions in the snow at the base of the stairs. I waited until the light dimmed enough to see the ground clearly before climbing down. The snow was deep and heavy, drifts as tall as my knees. The prince led to the tree-line and stopped. There was no sign of a camp, no tracks leading to a vehicle. Nothing, just snow and silence. I spent the night in the nearby ranger station, shaking and exhausted, trying to make sense of what had happened. The next morning, I returned to the tower. The prints were gone, melted or filled in by fresh snow. Everything looked ordinary. The cab swayed gently in the wind, the stove still cold and empty, the trapdoor secure. I checked my equipment, my supplies, everything untouched. There was no evidence anyone had been there except in my memory. I never learned who or what was outside. The rangers had no reports of anyone else in the area. The roads were closed, impassable. The tower was isolated. I tried to rationalize it. A lost hiker, a ranger I didn't know, someone who had been stranded. But no one ever came forward. No one was missing. I couldn't explain the precision of the steps, the timing, the silence. I left the tower as soon as the storm cleared and drove back down the mountain. The sun was out, the snow sparkling, mountains peaceful in the daylight. I tried to convince myself it was over, that what had happened was just coincidence, just the kind of thing that seems strange when you're isolated and scared. But I never stopped feeling the weight of those steps. They weren't random. They weren't accidental. They were deliberate. And they waited. I returned to the tower for my next shift weeks later. It felt different in the daylight. The wind was calm. The cab swayed slightly under my weight, but I was used to it. I logged the instruments, noted the weather, and kept an eye on the horizon. Nothing moved. Nothing approached. Still, I avoided the stairs outside whenever I could, checking the trapdoor constantly. I had learned something about people, about fear. It wasn't about what you could see. It was about what could wait. I finished that winter monitoring shift without another incident, but I never forgot that night. The memory of heavy boots climbing the stairs outside, precise and silent in the storm, stayed with me. The tower, the wind, the snow, all of it felt quieter, heavier, full of expectation. And I understood then that sometimes danger isn't loud. Sometimes it doesn't break in or force its way inside. Sometimes it waits. And when it does, all you can do is stay put and hope the storm lasts long enough for it to pass. I don't think I'll ever go back to a winter lookout alone. I can still feel those steps, the way they paused under the trapdoor, the patience. I've spent nights trying to imagine who it was, what they were doing, why they waited. I don't know. I don't think I ever will. I only know that they were real. And the storm kept me alive long enough to see them leave. I remember the first night clearly, the way the snow had swallowed the road and left the forest pressing in on all sides. We had rented the cabin because it was cheap and off-grid, something we joked about on the drive up, but by the time we arrived, the humor felt thin. The owner had warned us that storms came fast in the Adirondacks, but the warning hadn't prepared me for how the roads simply vanished under the accumulating snow. We had parked on a patch of frozen gravel that seemed barely wide enough for the car and hiked the last 100 feet to the cabin, dragging our bags through drifts that came up past our knees. The wind had stopped as soon as we reached the treeline, and the quiet there was immediate, total, like the forest had held its breath. The cabin itself was small, built from rough pine logs that smelled faintly of smoke and old sap. The windows were frosted over on the inside, and the heating system was limited to a single wood stove in the main room. We spent the evening chopping wood, filling the stove, and stacking it near the hearth, trying to keep warm. The temperature dropped sharply as night fell, and the only sound was the occasional crack of ice breaking in the small creek behind the cabin. It was the kind of quiet that made ordinary noises, like the groan of a log in the fire, startle you, though they were perfectly normal. By 9, the storm had intensified. The forest outside became indistinct, just a wall of white and black, the outlines of trees lost beneath layers of snow. I noticed it first while getting more firewood. The woods had gone completely silent. No wind rattling branches, no distant hum of cars, no calls of owls or other nocturnal animals. Just quiet, the kind that feels heavy and deliberate. I had expected the storm to bring noise, the whip of wind and snow, but instead, it was as though the air itself had been drained. It started around midnight. I woke to a sound that I couldn't immediately identify. Something was moving outside. At first, I thought it was a fallen branch sliding down the slope in the snow, but the sound continued. It circled the cabin. Slow, deliberate movements, sometimes heavier, scraping or dragging something, other times lighter and upright, like a person pacing along the edge of the clearing. I stayed in bed at first, telling myself it was an animal, probably a moose or a deer, maybe even a large dog, but the pattern didn't make sense. The tracks we later found were upright and staggered in a way that a four-legged animal could not have made. I could see faint impressions through the frost on the windows. Each time it passed, the frost seemed to crack in radial patterns, like tiny explosions frozen in ice. It wasn't loud, just small pops, subtle, almost easy to ignore, but every one of them made my chest tighten. I stayed by the window for long stretches, watching the snow, listening for any discernible rhythm. The movements were slow, patient, and repeated, circling from one side of the cabin to the other, sometimes stopping entirely, leaving a tense stillness. I noticed other things as the hours passed. The snow near the cabin had patches of deep indentations, wider than human footprints, irregularly spaced, as if something heavy was being carried and occasionally set down. One area looked almost like a stumble or a drop, a shallow trench dug into the snow. I couldn't see what had been dragged, but the lines were consistent with something substantial moving across the ground. It was methodical, careful, as if the creature, whatever it was aware of weight distribution, of balance, moving in a way that minimized effort yet maximized effect. Sleep became impossible. The others pretended to rest, but I could feel their tension in the room, the subtle shifting in the beds, the occasional cough or sigh that punctuated the silence. We all heard the same things, all of us waking at odd hours to the soft thumps and scrapes outside. I avoided speaking, because words felt unnecessary, the shared experience already too intense to articulate. By morning, the storm had slowed. The snow was waist-deep, and the forest seemed to exhale with a faint wind that rattled the outer walls. We ventured outside, stepping carefully through drifts that swallowed our legs. The tracks were clear now, upright, spaced unevenly, and something had indeed been dragged, a long, heavy branch, stripped of smaller limbs, lying partially buried in the snow, following a path that curved around the cabin like a faintly deliberate boundary. It was the closest thing I had ever seen to proof that what we'd heard wasn't imagined. There was no explanation, no sign of anyone nearby, just those marks and the memory of the night pressing down on me. We stayed in the cabin for the rest of the day, moving cautiously, gathering wood, checking the perimeter. Every small sound made me freeze. A flake falling from a branch, the creek whispering beneath ice, even the wind tapping on the logs felt intrusive. It was obvious that whatever had circled the cabin had been patient, aware, but never directly threatening. There was no attack, no attempt to break in, but its presence was undeniable. We saw the pattern of movement repeated, circling, dragging, upright then low, methodical and quiet. The rational part of me insisted on explanations. Wildlife, a hunter, someone lost, but nothing fit. By evening, we decided to leave. The storm had passed enough to make the road visible, if treacherous. We packed silently, stepping carefully over the tracks and the dragged branch, avoiding any sudden movements that might seem threatening to the forest itself. As we drove away, the trees slowly receding in the rearview mirror, I glanced at the snow near the cabin. The tracks continued toward the tree line, where they abruptly stopped. There was no sign of an ending, no evidence of retreat, only absence. I've gone back over that night countless times. I've studied the tracks, the frost patterns, the sound in my memory, trying to rationalize. I've compared it to known wildlife, lost hikers, logging accidents, anything plausible. Nothing fits perfectly. The dragging, the upright pacing, the deliberate circling, it all suggests intelligence, awareness, patience, but not malice. Whatever it was, it had moved around us for hours without making a single direct move to harm us. It wasn't hunting. It wasn't curious in any ordinary sense. It just existed in the perimeter, acknowledging us in the same way you notice furniture in a room. The clarity comes from the combination of evidence and absence. There was no supernatural element, no hallucination once we saw the tracks and the dragged branch. It was a living presence, grounded in physical reality, bound to the terrain and weather. The forest itself seemed to grant it camouflage, allowing it to move without disruption, unnoticed until the snow and frost betrayed it. The night became a study in observation. Presence versus action, weight versus sound, shadow versus form. I've returned to the Adirondacks since, but never that cabin. The road, once hidden, is clear now, but the memory of the patient movement through snow, the cracks in the frost, and the upright dragging remains vivid. I can't identify what it was, but I don't need to. I know it existed. I know the forest allowed it to operate in plain sight without confrontation. And that is enough. The horror of that night wasn't in danger or attack. It was in realizing that a mind, deliberate and methodical, had circled us for hours, fully aware we were there, and yet never touched us, never spoke, and disappeared without a trace. It was real, grounded, and utterly alien in its normalcy. I was driving through a storm that had come out of nowhere. The road was barely visible under the snow, and the tires on my old sedan struggled to find grip on the ice forming beneath the drifting white. I didn't plan to stop, but my headlights caught the flicker of a motel sign half buried in the snow, leaning as if it had been abandoned years ago. It blinked intermittently, the light struggling to break through the darkness and the storm. My tank was low, my hands were stiff from gripping the wheel, and the thought of another hour lost in the whiteout made me turn into the empty parking lot. The place was small, a single-story strip with peeling paint and frozen windows. The roof had ridges of snow that hadn't been shoveled, and icicles hung like dull knives from the edges. I pulled up to the office, a small boxy structure that looked more like a shed, and the door barely moved on its hinges when I pushed it. Inside, the clerk sat behind a counter littered with papers, cigarette ashes, and an old rotary phone. He didn't look up when I entered. I left my coat dripping on the floor, fumbled through my wallet, and he slid a key across the counter without a word. The hallway to my room was narrow, the fluorescent lights flickering and casting uneven shadows on the walls. The carpet was thin, threadbare, and littered with patches where the foam underneath showed through. The air smelled of wet wool, cleaning chemicals, and something faintly metallic. The door to my room closed with a solid thunk, leaving me alone in the thick silence of the storm outside. Inside, the room was small and cramped, with a bed that sagged in the middle and sheets that felt stiff. The window was fogged with condensation, and the curtain barely met the sill, letting in little pinpricks of the flickering neon outside. I stripped off my wet coat, hung it on the chair, and sank onto the bed, trying to convince myself I was safe, that it was just a storm and a lonely night. I turned the heat up, but the radiator wheezed like it had been left unused for months. My reflection in the dark window looked tired, pale, and out of place in a room that seemed older than the highway it sat beside. Around 2 in the morning, I heard it. A slow, deliberate tapping against doors in the hallway. It moved at a measured pace, pause after pause, almost like someone was testing the locks along the corridor. The sound didn't come directly to my door. It wasn't loud, but it was steady, insistent. I froze, listening, telling myself it was another guest, a maintenance worker, or just the old building settling. But the motel had no other cars, no lights from other rooms, no evidence that anyone else was awake. I tried to focus on the storm outside, the way the snow piled against the window, the sound of the wind pressing against the thin walls. The knocking continued, methodical, moving along the hall and then fading, replaced by a silence so complete it pressed against my chest. I lay there, thinking about calling someone, about leaving, but my car was buried in snow, and the thought of stepping outside in the storm made my skin crawl. The knocking stopped eventually, and I drifted into a shallow sleep, waking intermittently to the wind howling and the radiator coughing in the corner. Each time I blinked, the room seemed smaller, the walls closer, the darkness outside more absolute. When morning came, it was almost too bright. Sunlight reflected off the thick snow, glinting through the frost-covered window. I hesitated before opening the door, my stomach twisting. The hallway was untouched. No footprints, no scuff marks, not even the faintest disturbance in the thin layer of snow that had drifted in from the cracks under the doors. It was as if no one had walked the corridor at all. The knocking had been real. I knew that, but there was nothing to prove it, nothing at all. I went down to the office. The clerk was still there, slouched behind the counter, staring at the rotary phone as if it were a television. I left without speaking. I tried to explain the knocking, the footsteps I'd heard, but he didn't look up. There were no records of other guests the night before. No rooms occupied. No maintenance scheduled. The storm had cut this stretch of highway off for hours, and I realized that if anyone else had come in during the night, I would have noticed their car. There was only mine, buried in snow, alone in the lot. When I walked back to my car, the snow around it had hardened overnight, creating a crust that I had to break with my boots before climbing in. The highway was just a ribbon of white. No plows had come. No one had passed. I started the engine, feeling the vibrations of the heater against my legs, the low rumble against the silence. Slowly, I edged onto the road, every mile stretching endlessly, the storm finally letting up enough to make progress. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something at the motel's edge, a shadow slipping back into the hallway, a door closing gently behind me. There was nothing, just the flicker of the neon sign, dim and failing, half buried in snow. The memory of that night stayed with me for years. The way the knocking had sounded precise, almost deliberate. The way the hallway had remained untouched, pristine, as if nothing had disturbed it. Later, I learned the highway was notoriously isolated. The stretch where the motel sat often abandoned for days in winter storms, and the owners had no plow service, no regular cleaning, no checks after heavy snow. It made sense. The storm had trapped me there. The knocking had been something else entirely. Perhaps wind moving through the warped frames of the doors, settling metal panels, the building itself groaning under snow weight. Rational explanations could fill the gaps, but they never quieted the unease, the certainty that someone or something had walked the hall just out of reach. Years later, driving through a different storm, I found myself scanning the edges of the road for that same half-buried sign, for the quiet horror of being trapped in a place that existed on its own, indifferent to me, to anyone. I realized what had scared me most wasn't the possibility of another person, but the isolation, the way the world outside had disappeared under snow, leaving me alone with my own senses, my own fear. The motel wasn't haunted. It wasn't occupied by anything other than the storm and the building itself. But it was enough. It had made me aware, in the deepest, quietest way, that we are fragile, exposed, and entirely alone in moments like that. I never returned to that stretch of highway. I avoided it for years, and when I did pass by, the motel was gone, demolished or abandoned, leaving nothing but an empty lot and snow that drifted against nothing. The story ends there, in the quiet aftermath. The snow, the empty hallways, the car buried and waiting. I survived that night because I had no choice, but the fear lingered, the awareness that silence can be as deliberate, as precise, as a person walking door to door. Sometimes the world itself, through wind, snow, and decay, can feel deliberate enough to make you question everything you think you know about being alone. And that was enough horror for me, tangible, grounded, fully real, a fear that needed no ghosts to justify it. I grew up in that house, so I knew every creak, every groan it made when the wind hit the siding or the pipes shifted with the cold. I knew how the floors responded to weight, how the doors clicked when they expanded and contracted with the temperature. That familiarity became a kind of comfort, a rhythm I could trust. But the winter of 2009 broke all of that. The storm started in the late afternoon, thick clouds rolling in from the north, and by the time night fell, the snow had already begun to pile in drifts against the windows. By 7, the power went out. The house went dark, the only light coming from the few candles I had managed to set up before the wind knocked out the last few streetlights. The wind was a constant low howl outside, rattling the old window frames and pushing snow through every gap it could find. I had been sitting in the living room with one candle burning on the coffee table, reading, though the words blurred in the low light. That's when I first heard it, the slow, deliberate steps on the porch. At first I thought it was the wind against the boards, the way the storm made everything creak and shift. But then the steps continued, measured and separate, heavy with purpose. They weren't scattered like snow shifting or loose boards lifting in the wind. They were deliberate, pacing back and forth. I froze, straining to hear over the howl outside. The porch didn't connect to the driveway in a practical way. The wind would have made anyone standing out there miserable. Whoever it was would have been exposed completely, no cover, nothing to break the storm. I called out, hoping my voice would carry, hoping it was someone stuck in the snow, maybe a neighbor who had lost their way. The steps stopped immediately. Silence settled, broken only by the wind rattling the windows and the occasional groan of the house itself. I waited, counting seconds that stretched longer than they should have, but nothing moved. Then came the knocking. Not on the door, not anywhere I could reach from the front entrance. It came from the living room wall, the side of the house that faced open fields. The snow piled high there, and the wind was brutal. Whoever was outside shouldn't have been able to stand, let alone knock with such control. The knocks were firm, spaced like deliberate taps, almost trying to communicate. I pressed my back against the nearest wall, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was something heavy the wind had thrown, some loose branch scraping along the siding. But the sound was sharp, metallic almost, echoing against the bare wood. Each tap was a small, precise hammer strike. I knew that wall. I had spent years running my hands over it, fixing small cracks, checking for drafts. No loose panels. No hidden weak spots. Nothing that could produce that sound on its own. I moved to the window, careful not to make any sudden noise, trying to peer through the snow-streaked glass. The blizzard had turned the night into a white blur, but I could see the porch, the edge of the yard, the field beyond. Nothing moved. No footprints, no shadow, no form in the snow. The snow was too deep to cross unnoticed. The knocking continued for several minutes, irregular now, changing tempo, pausing in between bursts. I realized with a sinking feeling that I was hearing someone adjust their position between knocks, shifting weight, perhaps crouching. My pulse quickened. I thought of the old locks, the fact that all the doors were bolted from the inside. There was no easy entry. Still, the notion that someone could just be outside in that storm, at my house, broke every instinct I had about safety. I retreated to the kitchen, keeping low, scanning the room for anything I could use to defend myself. I had a small knife in a drawer, a few heavy kitchen utensils, anything. I grabbed a cast iron pan, feeling its weight settle in my hands, grounding me. Every noise outside became sharper, every crack and gust more menacing. The knocking stopped abruptly, replaced by silence. My ears strained, catching the subtle differences in the storm. Then, from the back of the house, I heard it, the scraping of boots in deep snow. It wasn't fast, not a run, but deliberate, slow, moving across the yard. The sound was faint, but unmistakable. The wind would have masked smaller movements, but this was deliberate and controlled, moving along the side where the field began. I moved toward the back door, checking the locks again. Nothing had been disturbed, no sign that anyone had entered. The snow outside was untouched in every direction I could see, pure and powdery, no footprints at all. That's when I noticed it, the faint outline of something pressed into the snow near the foundation. A hand. I couldn't tell. It melted quickly in the wind and falling snow, disappearing before I could analyze it. Every nerve in my body was taut, every sense alive to the storm and whatever was out there. I went back inside, pacing quietly, keeping my back toward the wall as I listened. The knocking didn't return. The pacing didn't return. Only the storm. And the occasional creak of the house, which now sounded alien and threatening instead of familiar and comforting. Hours passed. The wind eventually eased a little, though the snow piled higher. I kept all doors locked, windows covered, listening. Sleep was impossible. Morning came, pale and gray. The world outside was buried under more than a foot of snow. The field was empty, untouched, as though no one had ever been there. I stepped outside cautiously, checking the porch, the yard, the area near the living room wall. No footprints, no marks, nothing. I circled the house several times, scanning for any evidence that someone had actually been there. The storm had erased tracks, but the sheer effort to stand in that wind, the risk of exposure, made the idea of a person outside almost impossible. And yet the sounds, the knocking, the pacing, they were real. I had heard them. I wasn't imagining. My parents were away. The neighbors would have been far enough not to risk trudging through that blizzard. I stayed inside for the next few days, the house silent except for its own settling and the occasional distant wind. Eventually, the memory faded, replaced by routine, though I never left that back door unlocked again. I never figured out who, or what, was outside that night. The snow had erased every trace, and the storm had passed. Yet the image of someone, crouched against the wind, knocking on the side of the house with impossible patience and precision, stayed with me. It made the house feel different, larger and emptier, like it had been tested and I had witnessed it. I never saw a face, never heard a voice, but I knew with certainty that someone had been there. The house was familiar again, eventually, but the memory lingered in the bones of the walls, in the way I walked through the darkened rooms, in the careful double-checking of every lock before I went to bed. The storm ended, the world returned to normal, and yet the lesson of that night was clear. The quietest sounds, the slowest steps, and the most impossible knocks were real, and they could happen to anyone, in a place you know better than anyone else. I never understood why they had chosen that night, that storm, or that house. But I know it happened, and knowing was enough to change how I heard my home forever. I was 14 when it happened, in January of 2004, in rural Pennsylvania. It was one of those storms that makes the entire world seem smaller, the snow falling so hard and thick that the edges of the road disappeared within minutes. I remember the bus sliding into the ditch as if it were nothing more than a toy, the tires spinning uselessly on the slick ice, and the way my stomach dropped at the sudden halt. The bus leaned slightly to one side, wedged against a bank of snow that had built up along the edge of the road. The windows were fogged, streaked with ice, and I pressed my face against one, trying to see anything beyond the gray blur. The world outside had gone quiet except for the hiss of the wind, which cut through the bus in little gusts that made the old metal shiver. The driver said he would be back in 10 minutes, that he could make it down the road to a farmhouse where a phone still worked. He left quickly, stepping into the storm with his coat pulled tight, and the door swinging shut behind him left us staring at the empty road, the whiteout swallowing his figure almost immediately. The heater was old and struggling, coughing and rattling before finally cutting out entirely. The bus grew colder by the minute. We huddled in our coats, arms wrapped around ourselves, knees tucked to our chests, every exhale forming clouds that disappeared as quickly as they came. I could hear others shivering, whispers of fear in the small, enclosed space. Hours passed, or maybe it felt like hours. 2, 3, I lost count. The snow pressed against the windows, soft at first, and then hard as ice, and the wind made that terrible whistling sound through every crack in the bus. At first, the cold was the worst thing, then the fear, the knowledge that we were alone in the middle of nowhere. I could see their faces in the dim light, some pressed against the windows, some staring at the floor, some sitting perfectly still, staring into nothing. Nobody moved much because the floor was slick with melting snow from our coats, and the air inside was thick with the smell of damp clothing and fear. Then it started, the sound. Scratching, soft at first, almost like the metal of the bus was complaining under the weight of the storm, but it wasn't. It came from under the bus, irregular, deliberate, a slow scraping that made the floorboards shiver beneath my feet. It was gloves on metal, the sound of something dragging, deliberate but hesitant, as if whoever it was wasn't sure they wanted to be caught. Some of the kids screamed softly, the sound swallowed quickly by the wind that rattled the bus like a cage. Others just froze. I tried to convince myself it was branches, the wind picking up debris from the sides of the road. But it wasn't the wind, and it wasn't branches. The sound would stop and start, sometimes moving from one side of the bus to the other, slow, patient, and always beneath us. We sat like that, listening, and I realized how long the minutes could be when you are waiting for someone who isn't coming. There was no light except the gray that filtered through the snow and the faint orange glow of the bus's interior lights, flickering as the battery drained. My fingers were numb, and my toes felt frozen inside my boots, but I couldn't move. My eyes followed every shadow cast by the dim lights on the seats, looking for the source of the noise. There was nothing there. Only the bus, the snow, the dark shape of the road we couldn't see. I kept my coat wrapped around my shoulders, my backpack pressed against my legs, my chest tight with fear, trying to make myself small and invisible. The minutes stretched into hours. The snow piled higher, pressing against the bus, and the world beyond the windows became nothing but a solid, moving wall of white. I started counting the seconds in my head, the sound under the bus making me flinch every time it scratched against the metal. Occasionally, the scraping would stop, replaced by a faint thump, a noise like something small bumping against the undercarriage, and I would hold my breath, waiting for what I could not name. When the headlights appeared, they cut through the storm like a knife, sharp and sudden, blinding in the gray. The first thing I noticed was how quiet the world seemed in comparison. The snow around the bus was smooth, untouched, no footprints, no tracks. Nothing moved. The headlights belonged to another vehicle, a truck, and it approached slowly, tires crunching over the snow. The people inside the bus cried, some silent sobs, some shaking, some hitting the seats or covering their faces. Relief and terror mingled in my chest, a bitter taste that didn't go away. The driver never came back. We waited for him in the glow of the approaching truck, our eyes scanning the untouched snow outside, our ears straining for any sound that would explain what had happened. When the truck finally stopped and the driver stepped out, he shook his head at the scene, muttered something about taking us all back to town. The warmth of the truck was immediate and overwhelming, and I remember the way it felt to leave the bus, to step out of that small metal cage where nothing had moved for hours except the shadows under the seats. The snow that had trapped us for hours was hard and cold under our boots, compacted by the wind, but still pure and smooth, untouched as if nothing had existed there at all. We climbed into the truck one by one, shivering, crying, silent. Nobody spoke about the sound under the bus, the hours we had spent listening to it, the way it had made our skin crawl. It seemed better to leave it unspoken, better to pretend it had been the wind, a branch, some trick of the mind. But when I remember it, I remember everything. The cold, the smell, the sound, the way the bus leaned against the bank, the emptiness outside, the untouched snow, and the way the driver never returned. That night, I learned how long fear could stretch in a small, enclosed space, how a group of people could be trapped together with no one to protect them, and how easy it was for the world outside to vanish, leaving you alone with a sound you cannot explain. The memory is sharp, clear, as if it happened yesterday, because every detail mattered. The bus, the snow, the silence, the scratching that never had a source, and the smooth, perfect snow that swallowed the world outside. The lake shouldn't have been frozen. I knew at the moment we drove up and saw the gray, thin layer covering the water, flaking under the weak January sunlight. Locals had said it was safe, but the ice didn't look right. It had a dull, watery sheen, uneven in color, and when the wind pushed across it, it rippled slightly like it wasn't holding itself together. Snow was coming down sideways, driven by a wind that made the bare trees bend in odd, sharp angles. My boots crunched over a mix of powder and ice that had already partially melted in some areas. The farther we walked from shore, the more nervous I became, not because I expected it to give way immediately, but because it didn't feel solid. There was a hollow note underfoot, a tremor that carried through the thin ice, the kind of sound that makes your stomach turn even before your mind fully processes it. We set up near the shallows, right where the water met the frozen edge. The first few holes were easy to drill, the auger grinding into the ice with a metallic scrape. Each time it bit into the surface, tiny fractures spread outward like spider webs. The ice was cracking more than it should, the sound sharp and uneven, snapping under pressure. It wasn't dangerous yet, not dangerously so, but it was persistent enough that my chest tightened every time I stepped over a widening fissure. My friend crouched near one hole, testing it, tapping the edge with his glove, staring down into the black water. He said he thought he heard something brushing against the ice from below, something that moved in a way that made no sense for a fish. I laughed it off because it sounded ridiculous, the wind making everything echo, the snow muffling and exaggerating at the same time. But even as I joked, the sound of that ice, splitting under weight, gnawed at me. We spread out a little, staying close to shore, but far enough to feel we were part of the lake rather than its edge. The snow kept falling, powdering everything in a thick gray veil, the world shrinking to just the narrow swath of ice we occupied. Then, through the haze, I noticed a dark streak beneath my feet. At first I thought it was a shadow, a trick of the cloudy light, but as the snow briefly eased, the streak moved. Not darting like a fish, not erratic, but deliberate, as if some larger shape was sliding under the ice with purpose. I froze, the wind cutting against my neck, and my heart hammered in a rhythm that felt audible in my ears. The others hadn't noticed yet. I held my breath and watched the dark shapes multiply, slow, long, coordinated. They stayed below the ice, but moved in formations that suggested planning, almost too synchronized to be natural. My mind was searching for an explanation. Fish didn't move like that. Logs didn't move at all. It had to be something trapped, maybe forced under the ice by water currents, but even that didn't make sense. I could see the ripples in the thin layer above them, tiny vibrations traveling outward, as if the ice was responding to a weight that wasn't actually pressing down on it. I took a cautious step back, and a long crack split near my foot, running straight toward the deeper water, slicing the snow-covered ice like a knife through wax. I glanced at my friends. Their eyes were on the same thing now, wide, frozen in disbelief. We moved, slowly at first, testing the ice with each step. Every motion was accompanied by a series of small cracks, a sound like brittle glass under pressure. The shapes below shifted in response. They didn't scatter like panicked fish. They stayed together, following our movement, keeping pace in a way that was impossible to ignore. My stomach sank. The lake wasn't just thin, it was alive with motion, forces we couldn't see but could feel. I realized sharply that we'd misjudged it entirely. The ice was no longer a neutral surface. It was a thin, fragile membrane barely holding up what lay beneath. Panic crept in, measured at first, then boiling. Each step back toward shore felt like testing the limits of some invisible balance. The cracks spread faster than we did. Long fissures shot outward in jagged lines, converging toward our direction. Tiny splinters of ice popped up, tiny shards tilting as if pushed from below. I felt my hands trembling as I gripped the auger for balance. The others moved in silence, a single, unspoken agreement that speaking could disturb something we couldn't see but were already provoking. The snow began to settle again, muffling the cracking noises, But that only made it worse. The silence between bursts of fracture was loaded, like waiting for an impact you knew was coming. We broke into a slow run, boots slipping, augers abandoned, the snow now coming down in heavier sheets, icing over the cracks as we sprinted. The ice behind us groaned and shattered in long sheets, each section moving independently, colliding with a sound that punched through the wind. The shapes below followed. I caught glimpses of dark, elongated forms, not swimming like fish but gliding, moving with a coordinated intent toward us, guided by something we couldn't see or name. My lungs burned and my legs ached, but there was no choice. Each step felt like cheating death, the ice bending, giving, then snapping again under weight and pressure. We reached the shore in a staggered collapse, panting, chest heaving, gloves caked with snow and ice. I looked back and saw the lake in its full horror. The surface was fractured from end to end, a lattice of sharp cracks, each one vibrating as if the lake was settling after a massive, unseen disturbance. Long shapes could still be traced beneath the thin water that pooled in shattered sections, drifting slowly as though assessing the boundary of solid ground, the black forms moving with a patience that was terrifying. There was no splash, no sound of panic, only slow, deliberate movement under the ice. We never returned to that lake. Later, I learned that it was fed by a series of underground springs that never froze completely, pockets of flowing water, creating weak spots throughout the ice. That explained everything: the fractures, the impossibility of the surface, the strange movement that seemed intentional. There was no creature, no monster. Just water behaving unpredictably, forces we didn't understand, flowing beneath what we had assumed was solid. The shapes we saw were logs, branches, detritus caught in currents, moved by the spring's pressure in coordinated sweeping arcs. Our brains had assigned purpose where none existed, pattern where there was only physics. I never went ice fishing again. Every winter, when the air turns cold and snow drifts sideways across gray lakes, I think back to that day. I can still feel the thin ice cracking beneath my boots, still see the dark forms sliding beneath the surface, and still feel the pulse of fear that came from believing something could think under the ice. It was real in every sense: the lake, the cracks, the near collapse. But the terror came from understanding just how wrong we were, how fragile our assumptions, and how easily nature could unsettle us without ever touching a soul. That lake is still there, waiting under a brittle sheet of winter ice. It's nothing supernatural, nothing imagined. It's just water and cold, currents and pressure, fractures and gravity. But it taught me more about fear than any story or legend could. You don't need monsters when reality can move under your feet without warning.